Thank you, Bermaji, for this opportunity. And hello, everyone. I would like to welcome my colleagues from Mayo Clinic, Brenda Loufek and Dr. Lauren Rost. Brenda Loufek is the Director of Regulatory and Quality within the Center for Digital Health at Mayo Clinic. She leads the software as a medical device review board and is a leading subject matter expert in the field of regulatory affairs for digital health technologies, where she contributes to numerous publications and presentations. And Dr. Lauren Rost is a senior AI ML engineer who leads the AI Translation Advisory Council at Mayo Clinic. Lauren earned her PhD in biomedical informatics and has contributed to numerous publications and presentations to advance the safe and effective deployment of AI solutions. Together, they help Mayo Clinic innovators demonstrate safety and efficacy of their digital health solutions as they move through the AI lifecycle from development to deployment. So now the floor is yours, ladies.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate the invitation to be here today and talk about safe, effective, and ethical translation of AI-enabled digital health technologies into clinical practice. I will go ahead and share my screen because we do have a PowerPoint that we will walk through. Let me see. It'll just take me a moment to make sure that I get everything in the right location. All right, so hopefully you see my presentation. Yes? Okay, great. Lauren and I both really enjoy dynamic presentations, and I know that we're going to have roughly 30 minutes at the end of this presentation to take Q&A, but also feel free to put thoughts into the chat or jump in if you have a really hot or urgent question. I'm happy to take them in real time too for my portion of the presentation. I think Lauren would be okay with that as well. Okay, let's go ahead and get started with a brief disclaimer that the topics that we're covering today are related to laws, regulations, and guidance documents, which of course are subject to change. So take the information that we're sharing today with a bit of a grain of salt, knowing that this space will continue to evolve. We also don't have any conflicts of interest to report. Before I dive into the technical content today, I wanted to begin with a curiosity primer by presenting a real-world scenario to all of you for consideration. So I'm going to describe a product. This is a hypothetical product, but it very much could be a real one and is rooted in elements of very real AI-enabled technology that we have at Mayo Clinic. So I'll read it, but when I read it, please think about whether you would consider this product to be a medical device or not. And regardless of that answer, how might you ensure that it can be used safely, effectively, and ethically when deployed into the clinical workflow? So the product is an AI-enabled tool that provides healthcare professionals with a list of patients that may be at risk of falling and thus may require additional monitoring and assistance when moving about their room. So keep this product in mind as we walk through our slides, and we'd be happy to revisit this at the end of our presentation and think through how we would consider AI governance from a Mayo Clinic perspective for a tool such as this one. So to kick us off, I do want to contextualize the space of AI governance in healthcare by really sharing some special considerations within this particular environment that we factor in when we think about our roles and responsibilities. Healthcare institutions have a long history of embedding governance into their systems for the protection of patients, providers, and the overall practice. When it comes to developing AI-enabled technologies, they are in a great position that includes proximity to the patients and to the problem. So they're well positioned to be able to develop tools that will be safe, effective, and ethical, and that will solve or address different solutions that we know are highly needed in their particular environment. But when it comes to AI-enabled digital health technologies, some healthcare institutions just might not have that particular experience or expertise as it relates to AI-enabled technologies. So, with our conversation today, we hope that you can walk away really understanding what Mayo Clinic has done with identifying those different subject matter expertises and embedding them within an AI governance infrastructure. By no means are we covering the full spectrum of AI governance within healthcare institutions. We're really going to be focusing on regulatory and translation science today. But I think that those are two key pillars for what is new and novel about governance in healthcare when we are talking about AI enabled technologies. At Mayo Clinic, we take an interdisciplinary approach to sharing the responsibility of AI governance. At the foundation, we are looking to things like standards, laws, regulation, that which is considered state of the art, in order to inform other practices that are part of this shared responsibility model that include things like external oversight from different governance bodies like the FDA, who has oversight over digital health technologies that contain AI enabled functionality that may meet the definition of a medical device. We also, within our model, have internal accountability bodies. And Lauren and I are going to cover two of those that we have built out here at Mayo Clinic today. The first one is the Software as a Medical Device Review Board. The second one is the AI Translation Advisory Council. We believe that these internal accountability bodies, in combination with these different external oversight groups, have much of the responsibility of interpreting those standards, laws, state of the art in order to apply them appropriately within your local environment or institution. But in addition to those groups, we also believe that the product teams themselves, including their department or their division, have a piece of the responsibility puzzle. And part of that goes to this culture of safety that is within healthcare institutions, where those teams, those healthcare professionals, are really closest to the problem, and they're also most knowledgeable about what it might take to deploy a product safely, effectively, and ethically because of their specific expertise and clinical knowledge of the local situation. So we combine all of these different areas of responsibility to ultimately take a multidisciplinary approach to accountability for safe, effective, and ethical translation of tools into clinical practice. I don't want to assume that everyone in this call is intimately aware of regulation of AI, so I'm going to take just a couple of minutes to root you in some of this baseline information about how FDA would regulate AI, as it is fundamental to the work that we do with the SAMD Review Board, which I'll go into in just a minute. So the broadest category that FDA uses for these software features or functionalities is called digital health technologies. And a digital health technology can span anything from an app on your phone that helps you with reducing stress via different meditation techniques, all the way to really complex technology that's analyzing medical images to help with detection and categorization of cancer. So digital health technologies is incredibly broad. And within digital health technologies, we do have a distinction between that which would be a medical device compared to that which is a non-medical device. FDA's definition of the former is any technology that would be used to diagnose, cure, mitigate, or prevent a disease or condition in humans. We see a number of products that fall into this digital health space, however, not meeting that definition. And there have been a number of software categories that have been carved out by law and then adopted by FDA regulations and clarified in different guidance documents or publications that these functionalities are considered lower risk and therefore outside of FDA's oversight. And therefore, those regulations do not apply. And that's where we see so much of these AI enabled digital health technologies being developed within healthcare institutions. and often are the focus of AI governance because these medical devices have very clear laws and regulations that they need to follow within what's called a quality management system. We don't have those clear directives for non medical devices. Things like AI enabled tools that are helping with administrative activities for scheduling patients or providing summarizations of different notes. They might not fall into FDA's definition of a medical device. And this is where local governance, local oversight becomes so crucial. Okay, I could spend a whole week talking about the difference between medical devices and non-medical devices when it comes to AI-enabled technology, but I want to make sure that we get to the root of how we're applying this at Mayo Clinic.
Brenna, can I ask
Yeah,
one quick question?
sure.
If you go back, I kind of get the sense of like the administrative tools and why they're non-medical devices. I was
Hmm.
wondering if you could talk a little bit more about clinical decision support. That oftentimes comes up, and you know,
Yeah.
I could see it being used to mitigate, for example, just going back to the case you asked us to reflect on as you go
Yeah.
through.
Yeah.
Um, how does FDA think about that as a non-medical device versus when it might kind of
Mhm.
be pushed over?
Let me give you a
And Brenda,
yeah.
I wanted to add one sentence because I have the same question. So why did our AI ECG algorithm all need to go through FDA approval? Because they are clinical decision support too, right? So I'm just
Hmm.
have the same question.
Great. Let me give you all a crash course on non-medical device clinical decision support software tools. So, just because a product is clinical decision support software does not always mean that it can be considered a non medical device. Four things have to be true about that CDS tool. I'm going to abbreviate it a clinical decision support software as CDS. Four things have to be true about that CDS technology. The first thing, which is going to answer your question about the ECG algorithm, is that the product cannot interact with medical images, signals, or patterns. So it can't be analyzing those things. If your CDS tool is doing that, you're most likely a medical device. So that's why we see the ECG algorithm being considered a medical device. So I think you're referring to the left ventricular ejection fraction product that was reviewed and cleared by FDA about a year and a half ago. The reason for that is even though we might consider it a CDS tool, it does not satisfy that first criteria. The second criteria is that it has to include patient-specific information or other general medical information. This criterion is not that contentious. Most CDS tools are doing this. The third one is that the output of the tool has to be limited to a suggestion or a recommendation. And FDA is particularly concerned about something called automation bias, where the end user would over rely on the output of the tool to make clinical decisions for their patients. Automation bias in FDA's mind could be triggered by two primary situations or circumstances. The first one would be if the clinical decision support software produces an output that's considered singular or specific as it relates to a disease, a diagnosis, a treatment, or a prevention activity. So if you had an algorithm that's running in the electronic health record that said, Brenna is at risk of breast cancer, that could be considered singular and specific, and therefore potentially trigger automation bias or over reliance on the output of the tool, thus making the product higher risk. And therefore, the FDA would like to see a tool such as that being put into the medical device category so that the right level of oversight or controls can be in place to ensure that the tool is used safely and effectively. Another consideration that FDA has put forth that could lead to automation bias is a time critical situation or scenario. And this could include clinical decision support tools that contain things such as alerts or notification that are tied to specific action that would need to be taken. So we think often about what is the environment of use for a clinical decision support tool. It's much lower risk if you're using a CDS tool before you meet with a patient in a low stress, non-time critical situation or scenario, as opposed to many healthcare institutions have this tool, a sepsis detection tool. So a tool that is maybe on a daily or hourly basis, interacting with patient-specific information in order to identify patients that are at risk of sepsis and therefore triggering some sort of alert to a healthcare professional to take a look at that patient and see if some sort of interventional activity should occur to prevent sepsis or the progression of sepsis. So the tool can only be providing a suggestion or a recommendation. It can't be providing something that may lead to automation bias, because then that presents additional risk that FDA thinks would put the product into the medical device space, thus requiring different controls and oversight to ensure that it can be used safely. The last criterion in order for a product to be considered a CDS non-medical device tool is that the outputs of the tool have to be explainable and transparent. So if we have a tool that is identifying different treatment options for a patient that already has been diagnosed with breast cancer, you have to be able to explain why those treatment options would be applicable to your patient. And this is often achieved with like a hover icon that describes the different inputs or variables that led to that particular output. But this can be difficult to do, especially as we talk about more complex technology like generative AI. How do you explain a summarization that's providing some sort of insights about a patient based on a bunch of information found in the electronic health record? I can sort of hypothesize maybe providing links to the original source document could help explain the output of that tool. But FDA is pretty specific about kind of what they're looking for in terms of making sure that those inputs are there for reference so that the healthcare professional can think critically about whether that output really applies to their patient or not. Does that answer the question about clinical decision support software?
Yes, and why do they care about whether the input include images or not?
Yeah, why does FDA care about
Yeah,
that?
yeah.
So first, I want to offer one clarification. You can use inputs from reports of medical images. You just can't be directly analyzing the medical image or directly analyzing a signal or pattern. I believe that the justification would be that if you are analyzing a medical image, signal, or pattern, two things are happening that would increase the risk of the product, therefore requiring additional oversight of FDA's medical device regulations. The first being that it becomes harder to explain why a particular output is occurring. So if you have an algorithm that's running on, let's say, 15 different demographic variables found within the electronic health record, and it's producing some sort of output for a recommendation, that's pretty explainable and transparent, right? Like I can understand what that output is affiliated with. But when a product is analyzing a medical image, signal, or pattern, you then lose that explainability. FDA also thinks that analyzing this medical information just poses more risk in general. So additional testing, additional verification and validation should likely occur for this technology. And they can ensure that that happens by calling the product a medical device, thus requiring having to follow the different requirements for whatever that type of medical device is. How's that? Do you have
Yeah, that's super helpful.
Okay.
That's so clear.
Okay. FDA's entire framework is looking at risks versus benefits, which I'll keep moving here. Their system of even determining whether a product is a medical device or not is really all about managing and mitigating risks so that the benefit of the tool can really be optimized. So so FDA uses this infrastructure, this framework, and Mayo Clinic uses it as well. So regardless of a digital health technology being a medical device or not, we leverage a risk-based approach to all of our AI-enabled digital health technologies. And we have a number of different risk domains that we look at. As I mentioned, healthcare institutions are already very good at governance and the protection of patients and providers in the practice. But AI does introduce some additional subject matter expertises that we want to think about and make sure that we are appropriately evaluating those risks. So Lauren and I are here today representing regulatory risks as well as translational risks. And we apply the same framework regardless. So we use this iterative approach, which is well established within industry, particularly in the medtech industry, to use this framework of identifying the risks, doing some sort of calculation, such as a scale of severity times probability, to determine what that risk calculation would be. Then, for those risks that are at an unacceptable level, we do mitigation. So these would be like design changes, labeling changes, training, things that would bring that risk from a higher level to a lower acceptable level. And then after the product has been deployed, we monitor those risks because, especially with AI, definitely with generative AI, we don't always know what all of those risks are going to be until the product is used in the real world. So we have to continue to monitor those risks to identify if any modification should occur to the existing risks and the calculations we've applied, or if we have to add new risks that we have not yet considered. So let me share a little bit about how we embed this from a regulatory perspective into Mayo Clinic. Thinking again about our shared responsibility model, we have stood up the SAMD review board. So this is software as a medical device review board that is a cross-functional group that has a number of representatives, which I will share those details in just a moment, that look at all AI-enabled digital health technologies being developed internally and are seeking deployment internally here as well for consideration of regulatory and clinical risks. So I have here this shared responsibility model. We have the product team, we have the SAMD review board, which is a governance group within Mayo Clinic. And then the Center for Digital Health has a number of different subject matter expertises, including regulatory and systems engineering. These expertises are intended to mirror what you would see in industry. So if we think about more traditional legal manufacturers of AI-enabled digital health technologies, these would be companies like Medtronic or Siemens. These companies have the existing expertise in regulatory, systems engineering, quality that we see that allow for that application of different practices that align with laws, standards, regulations, best practices. Healthcare institutions historically don't have that. So here at Mayo Clinic, we have hired staff to really fill that role. And in this context, I am referring specifically to regulatory experts. And together we form this shared responsibility model where we look at AI-enabled digital health technologies and consider regulatory risks. So you might be curious who actually sits on this board. It is split up into voting members and non-voting members, wherein consistent with Mayo Clinic's overall culture, the SAMD review board is physician-led, where the majority of our voting members represent different clinical areas. We do have representatives as well from nursing, as well as regulatory and research, and that's the shared service that's represented on the right. We also have a number of non-voting members that represent different areas of expertise that are crucial for evaluating different regulatory risks as well as clinical risks prior to deploying a product into clinical practice. And you can see those displayed here. Just to be explicit, the SAMD review board is charged with the responsibilities of evaluating regulatory and clinical risks by these software technologies and making recommendations to product teams to employ different controls that would mitigate those risks, thus allowing benefits to be optimized so that we can deploy tools in a clinical practice that are safe, effective, and ethical. To put this work into context, I did want to overlay the general responsibilities of AI governance against the life cycle of a typical AI-enabled software technology. So we do have AI governance that is embedded throughout this life cycle. We can think about other functionalities like the IRB, who are going to have oversight over the early stages of initial development of the tool to get access to data or to do some early valid clinical association of a model before you're looking to translate it into clinical practice. The SAMD review board along this spectrum really has primary governance oversight for those tools that are being deployed into the clinical workflow. And we engage teams anywhere kind of along this life cycle between like the mid development to validation to bring forth the product to the review board so that they have time to take feedback related to controls or mitigations that the board requests of the product team so that they can implement them before they deploy into clinical practice. So the SAMD review board is just one element of this broader AI governance infrastructure that we have at Mayo Clinic. And it's at this time that I will hand it over to Lauren, who will talk about another facet of AI governance, which is the AI Translation Advisory Council.
Brenna, can I ask
Yeah.
before Lauren takes over? So
Yeah.
first of all, man, that was like 30 of the best minutes I've ever heard on AI, governance and health system adoption. So thank you.
Mm-hmm.
The second question is, does that SAMD review board, does it just have kind of regulatory oversight, or does it also control resources? And by that I mean, like, anytime you're bringing in, like, let's say, an algorithm and you're deploying it within health systems, there's a cost, right? I mean, your IT groups have to embed this typically within environments like Epic. Do you guys also not only just give the green light, but then also say this is of a priority for the system and we will deploy resources so that it's utilized and embedded in a way that's not going to break all the other parts of the system? Does that question make sense?
Yes, the question makes total sense. And my answer is no. The SAMD review board does not have that responsibility. And I want to be honest with this group because we all are here to learn from each other and advance safe use of AI and admit that this is an area where we can do better. The role that AI governance plays at Mayo Clinic right now and at all healthcare institutions is highly decentralized. I think that we see different risk domains siloed from each other. So you just described a very significant risk domain that is not covered by the SAMD review board, but would be covered by another functional area, likely a combination of like business or departmental leadership, or maybe even other groups that I'm not aware of. But a product team would have to navigate these different risk domains themselves, which is one of the challenges that we see within these decentralized organizations, that there certainly is frustration that a risk is evaluated here, but maybe not over here. But all of those considerations are crucial for a successful implementation into clinical practice. So this is one area, the integration of different risk domains for a more streamlined review of deploying products into clinical practice, where we can certainly look to improve.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Lauren, let me hand it off to you.
All right, thank you, Bren. So Bren described the SAMD review board, and I lead the AI Translation Advisory Council. And of course, we collaborate and work incredibly close together to cover the scope of helping product teams to demonstrate safety and efficacy in deploying their solutions. And so the AI Translation Advisory Council, for which Xiaoxi is a member, is a cross-functional group that advises the enterprise on AI best practices to inform review processes for AI solutions before deployment into the clinical workflow. So we help teams to demonstrate evidence of safety and efficacy according to AI best practices, in order to support our governance groups with that AI subject matter expertise, just like Bren said. So how do we help have this shared responsibility of partnering with the product team, meeting the team where they are at in terms of their clinical knowledge and expertise and development of the tool, as well as supporting governance with AI subject matter expertise and this multidisciplinary team of the AI Translation Advisory Council. And so the components of this council are 25 representatives, and our expertise
Sorry, Lauren,
span.
I think I went through the slides too fast. Would you just tell me when you want me to advance?
Yes,
Okay,
next slide is great. Next
You want
slide.
me to go to the next one?
Yep, thank
Okay,
you.
sorry about that.
No, you're good, you're good. You were perfect. So the AI Translation Advisory Council consists of 25 representatives across the Mayo Clinic enterprise, and our expertise spans data science, AI ethics, regulatory, so Bren here, AI engineering, IT data connections, user research is incredibly important for our scope of translation, as well as clinical workflow mapping, which is really vital to demonstrating to these governance groups of what are the inputs and outputs of these models, what's the timing here in terms of feasibility for deploying the solution. Also, business and ventures representation within the council, and electronic health record integration. So where would this model be most efficient and effective in sitting within the healthcare record? And so we advise on AI best practices to really socialize and help evaluate demonstrating evidence of safety and efficacy as it relates to AI best practices, and provide this kind of ad hoc evaluation for both internally and externally developed AI solutions. So another part of our scope is supporting the Mayo Clinic sponsors that are bringing in vended solutions to implement within the record. So that way these Mayo Clinic sponsors can demonstrate that the vended solutions that they are procuring have taken into account AI best practices. Next slide, please. And so these are our AI translation best practices. So we help support product teams to demonstrate, of course, a clinical champion, and also that there's this departmental support and resources for maintaining this tool. To kind of circle back on that point, we want to make sure that models will not be orphaned if a clinical champion, for example, leaves the institution, or if models go down, who can be contacted around surrounding information around the model. We also help teams to demonstrate that they have taken into sufficient consideration engagement with users. So this is really important to demonstrating the clinical workflow pre and post model implementation to demonstrate what is the change that this model is making, how does it impact decision makers, and how does it interact with users, which can be a really important artifact in informing the downstream decisions being made in the SAMD review board as well, to help understand the kind of risks in that sense. We also help teams to document AI ethics and fairness. So for all of these considerations, we have accompanying toolkits and resources that further help teams to demonstrate best practices. And we're really looking to democratize learnings of translating models into the clinical workflow. So that way we can kind of get out of teams' ways, make this information accessible to product teams to support and enable this progression through the AI lifecycle. We also look for teams to demonstrate that there's validation of this model performance, what are the methods surrounding a pilot study, for example, methods surrounding a silent evaluation, if appropriate, for the particular tool. Another really important area that we advocate for and consult on and support product teams is this implementation plan. So how do we be really intentional about introducing this model into the clinical workflow? We're making sure that users are educated. There's a really intentional introduction of this model. How will it be turned on and updated and audited? And that relates to the post-deployment operational plan as well. So how will this tool what is the audit cadence here? And then also another important aspect of this is how can we set a model threshold of insufficient performance? So if there is model shift or drift or some kind of a number of user feedback that relates to a certain error, let's have the methods in place to de-implement the solution and retrain, visit these errors to then bring the model back up. So that way we can all really follow a methodology and protocol there. Next slide, please. So this is an example of our internal SharePoint site that hosts our AI best practices, as well as the additional resources that help support product teams in navigating and understanding what are expectations for these AI solutions and for deploying. Next slide, please.
Lauren, can I ask
Hey.
another question?
Yeah.
So this is so wonderful, and I really appreciate you guys even sharing like the who in terms of, makes up these councils and even the group that you had mentioned, Brenna. Can you tell me a little bit more about this council? How often do you guys meet? What's the volume of like, I'm not sure if you're going to share that later, but like, everything you're describing sounds so wonderful. It's very comprehensive. One of the tensions we've had at Michigan is that comprehensiveness versus just, I mean, most of the people have other jobs and responsibilities, and the volume of these types of models, especially if you're broadly defined, can almost feel like it's overwhelming. I'm wondering if you could speak to that. So this council you're talking about, you guys meet bi-weekly? What's the volume of cases that, not cases, but like, algorithms or tools that you guys are handling?
Yeah, so that's a fantastic question. Yeah, on actualizing and operationalizing. So I would say that we have really evolved as an AI Translation Advisory Council. We have done consultation with really one-off engagements with product teams to one at a time consult and support teams through the AI lifecycle. And we've evolved into this position of consulting multiple innovations at the same time to support them in demonstrating safety and efficacy. And so that has taken some kinds of change management. Yeah, exactly what you're saying on like how do we make sure that individuals properly allocate for their time and are involved and up to speed on all of these products. So in terms of numbers, for a smaller core team of evaluating evidence of best practices, we meet weekly to discuss the products that are coming through the pipeline and those that we are evaluating for AI best practices. A growth opportunity is really the council as a whole. That is a small subset of the council. The council as a whole meets monthly. And so we have been at this space of growing towards how to operationalize this AI best practices and evaluation in coordinating across all of these numbers. And so that's an area that we're kind of growing towards. But yeah, we're kind of inching and growing up to that to be able to be respectful of everyone's time. So previously the council met monthly to review one product. And so how do we evolve and mature into organizing 25 individuals to review multiple products at a time is an area that the council is a growth opportunity. But Bren can definitely speak to the maturity of the SAMD review board that does review models with a different scope and with higher numbers. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Lauren. So I do want to be clear that Lauren and I, probably 80% of our time is dedicated to this work. So a number of the experts, especially like the clinical or other technical experts that sit on these boards, this is not their full-time job. They're being staffed at like 1 hour a week or 1 hour every other week to be able to support these reviews. But there are a number of individuals within the Center for Digital Health whose entire job is focused on getting teams to the point of being reviewed by the board or the council. So from like a high aerial level view, I want to share that we are aware of around 400 digital health technologies being developed at Mayo Clinic. So this is where I use the term user innovator, meaning the person who is both developing the tool wants to be the one using the tool. And that's where our 400 number comes from. These are tools anywhere from kind of early ideation, exploratory phase to deployment into clinical practice. And of the 400, 80% of those will contain some sort of AI-enabled technology and increasingly Gen AI-enabled technology. So far, the SAMD Review Board has reviewed and endorsed around 40 of those tools. Now, sometimes when we are reviewing and endorsing tools, we are setting categorical precedent for the expectation of safety and efficacy for other products that would fall into that same general intended use as well as underlying operating technology. This is a really simple example, and it might sound silly, but the SAMD Review Board has looked at setting precedent for calculators. So every healthcare institution is going to be using calculators, those that contain AI as well as those that do not. Mayo Clinic has thousands of calculators that don't contain AI-enabled functionality, and the SAMD Review Board took a look at those calculators, compared them to FDA regulation for what we consider for the regulated status of calculators, and set the general precedent that we would not apply the rigor of medical device requirements for calculators within the healthcare institution. Now, this example just might sound silly because so many healthcare institutions are using things like tools to calculate BMI, but I use that as an example as to how the board operates, not always looking at individual products, but looking at a product and setting categorical precedent for the rest of the organization. It's really hard to set categorical precedent for AI-enabled technology because the risks of these tools are so highly tailored to the specific use case or the environment in which they would be used. So we see it harder to do that for AI-enabled technologies. And so we tend to have to look at those on a one-off basis. So those are our numbers. We've reviewed and endorsed around 400 AI-enabled digital health technologies while setting precedent for different categorical considerations across the enterprise.
Thank you. So did you just, that last thing you said was so you've approved 40 out of 400 but you've reviewed 400, huh?
We have not reviewed all 400. So I'm going to skip back to this one, this slide here. Sorry, I'm going to zoom really fast and I want to show you this chart. Okay. So when we think about the 400 products falling somewhere within this spectrum, the SAMD Review Board and the AI Translation Advisory Council really comes into play with doing our evaluation when the product is at this like transitional stage from validation to deploying it into clinical practice.
Right.
Not many of the 400 tools are at that stage. Most of them are still in this like prepare development. They're doing valid clinical association. They're doing things like piloting the product or kind of doing silent deployment type studies. So our experts can consult at that time, but when I say we've reviewed and endorsed, I'm talking about tools that are highly mature and are looking to be deployed into clinical practice.
Super helpful, Brenna. Thank you. Larry, it looks like you got your hand up.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So it is fascinating, but I just a note of caution.
Please.
We've been dealing with alarms in health systems for years, and AI is just another kind of an alarm. We actually wrote a commentary, Vinny Chopra and I, called "Alarmed and Dangerous" in JAMA, which took up the mantle from the Institute of Medicine, which demonstrated that the surfeit of alarms in healthcare have actually made us less aware of critical events because of the multitude. And when you hear that, everyone in their brother's creating an AI system because that's the thing we do now. It's going to be a huge increase in these AI-based alarms that are going to be brought into a sea of alarms or a swamp of alarms, depending on your analogy. And we know that there are already problems today with what we have. Creating more of those things to throw at people and at patients in our health systems, it seems to me is going to take a lot of the understanding of how those get utilized, number one, and hopefully how they get integrated so that there is as a general picture of a patient or of an issue, and not just a series of one-off alarms going off every 5 minutes and ignored by everyone. So I think this is, I understand sort of what you're doing, and it's fantastic. But it's the on-ramp onto a superhighway where crashes are occurring every 3 minutes. So having more things hitting the runway, hitting the on-ramp, potentially could make things worse, not better. And it's a major issue that we haven't addressed as a health system, as a health. And I think that we have to be aware of that, even as we do go through due diligence in bringing on the one-off alarms in AI. We have to recognize that there is an AI, not AI, there's an alarm crisis. And I think we have to be aware of how to use the tools that we have that are unique to try to bring more order and understanding to the multitude of disparate alarms that we and others create. So anyhow.
I could not agree with you more. I think that there's this tension right now with such attraction and interest to make claim to the fact that healthcare institutions are using AI right and left, right, to do earlier, faster, better work. But we have to think pragmatically about whether that tool can actually be adopted into clinical practice, and is it moving the needle on actual improvement compared to standard of care without additional alarms and whatnot. So when we think about evaluating the tool, we want to look at kind of micro level evaluating it, doing verification and validation, but also considering different study designs, ideally before deployment outside of research, but we could do it after it's been deployed in a clinical practice as post-deployment activities, but studying it in the real world scenario and understanding what additional risks or barriers arise when the tool is used in that real world context. Lauren, I wonder if maybe you want to comment on the role that engagement with end users and contextual research plays in trying to mitigate this potential risk that we heard from Lawrence.
Yes, yeah, I agree. I couldn't agree more on the risk of deploying all of these tools, and how do we consider model inputs and outputs, especially as we change the clinical workflow so quickly. So I fully agree. And how do the outputs interact with one another, with all of these different signals that we're providing to the clinician and the user? And so part of our work is mapping out the clinical workflow, looking at the decision points. Where is this model integrating within the clinical workflow pre and post model implementation? And I think exactly what you're saying, in the not too distant future, we will be seeing an overlap of these clinical workflows with multiple model, interacting within the same workflow potentially. And so how does that impact users? How does that impact model quality and performance as well, and data quality, the inputs? I think that's a really important consideration. And another element of that too is comparing similar models and use cases too. I think that's another open question of how do we, given the excitement around many common use cases, like sepsis, for example, there can be multiple models, and how do we take in that consideration if there are multiple models deployed for the same use case or clinical pain point as well? So yeah, I think that this is an important growth opportunity, an area to keep a close look on.
Yeah, I
that we-
also want to weigh in a little bit because I feel this is a little bit outside Lauren or Brent's. Because for example, for many years, my department has been doing a lot of work because for most AI shouldn't be deployed. I mean, most of them when you test in routine clinical practice adds very little value. So a lot of time is you just deploy so many tools without rigorous evaluation. And to Brent's point, a lot of the AI these days have to fall under medical devices just because the complex technology, the multimodality. So it's not something. So if you want to go through FDA approval, that's time consuming, resource consuming, and we have conducted many pragmatic trials as well. And before the pragmatic trials, you need to do the user-centered design, figure out to which individual, right, patient or clinician, which type of clinician, you have to talk with their department leadership, clinician champion, site leaders, administrators, OM, OAs, and then do a usability and acceptability, right? Is this what we imagine should be deployed at this time to this clinician is the right? Maybe it's not the right way. And throughout the evaluation or the trials, you also do some mixed method study to test the implementation approach. So eventually, this should be an integrated approach. There shouldn't be that many alerts. That's just my take.
So just one more note of caution. All the alarms we currently have FDA approval. So the FDA process doesn't protect us from creating a Tower of Babel in hospitals that make the alarms, which individually look to provide value, collectively, they create a morass of confusion and have little collective value. And that was the IOM report.
Yeah,
so I think
I agree. Yeah, but it's just like how many of those alerts really conducted those rigorous evaluation, user-centered design, implementation, and pragmatic trials, right?
FDA approval.
I mean, it's
That's all you're
approved,
going
but
to get
then
is FDA approval.
realistically, these days, a lot of these AI is trying to go through the business development and ventures. When you go to another health system and try to convince them buy your product, how likely you are just going to convince them without these considerations in this more and more competitive environments? There are so many similar AI algorithms, even AI ECG doing the same thing. So how do you convince this health system buy yours, not the other Viz AI or so I guess you have to, the standards is definitely rising. I agree with the traditional problem. There are so many alerts that's quite a challenge for us every time we want to convince primary care clinician to participate in our trial. I mean, they probably has this hesitation, oh, another alert. So
And this is potentially one area where medical institutions or those in academia could publicly comment to FDA or other groups that are influencing best practices for non-medical device AI-enabled digital health technologies to require some sort of practice of demonstrating safety and efficacy in a real world environment, as opposed to the current framework for most FDA reviewed products, which is that they have to demonstrate safety and efficacy of substantial equivalence, meaning that they are as safe and effective as a tool that has been previously reviewed by FDA that has a similar intended use and technology. So most legal manufacturers can demonstrate that safety and efficacy via substantial equivalence through study design that does not involve real world simulation and integration with other systems. So just a call for an opportunity for folks to engage in the broader discussion that's happening at the federal level.
Brenna, this is such a great discussion. I was wondering, like, with just a few minutes left, Xiaoxi, can we go back to your original case? I don't know if that's how you guys were going to end, but like we obviously derailed a little bit, but this is so wonderful. Like that original example you mentioned about the AI enabled tool.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah. What are your thoughts on this? I mean, I'd be curious. And then obviously you threw a couple of questions in the chat too that were very interesting. I'd be curious what folks think about that. And I'm looking at Andrew Wong, who's one of our junior kind of like emerging faculty here, who's living in this space and taking a lot of roles at our institution. But yeah, Brenna, do you want to talk a little bit about this case?
Yeah. So would you like me to walk through how I would potentially answer some of these
Uh,
questions, or would
100.
folks maybe like to take a pass at answering it themselves?
Andrew, how do you think Michigan Medicine would answer this question?
Brahmaji, there's a very political answer that I'm supposed to give here, which is we will follow FDA guidelines to the toe. I think in general, this is a moving space, right? I don't know if anyone's actually followed the recent release of FDA rule. I think it was actually like last week or something like that. They've actually released like further guidelines of like what they're requiring or recommending vendors to provide what information of like of some of these models that vendors are kind of putting out to hospitals. So this is a rapidly evolving space. I think for us, we're trying to do pretty much what Mayo is doing here, right? Like we have our clinical intelligence committee, which kind of mirrors a lot of what Mayo is doing here, and really trying to make sure that people are knowledgeable of the facts and understand that there's more to there's more nuanced implementation than just the FDA guidelines. But at the same time, you do have to make sure that you're kind of following all the rules. So I don't have any silver bullet, Brahmaji, but I'm excited to kind of see that there are a lot of parallels between what I see Brendan and Lauren presenting here and what we're doing here at Michigan as well.
Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah,
I
Brenna.
can tell you,
Yeah,
yeah.
walk us through this.
Sure. Let me tell you what I would want to know and what we would do and how this would embed itself into the SAMD review board. And then I know we only have a couple minutes, Lauren, if you want to comment if there's time later about what the AI Translation Advisory Council would do. So hypothetically, this would be an internally developed solution. So I would have direct access to the innovator. I would schedule a 30-minute call where I would ask a number of questions, learning more about what is the current standard of care to manage patients that are at risk of falling. I want that foundational information, which I'm not a healthcare professional, so I don't know what that is. So I would have to start by understanding how we manage patients that are at risk of falling. I would want to know more about what the overall healthcare environment is. What types of patients are we talking about? Ones that are just coming in for a primary care visit, ones that are in clinic being hospitalized. Are they there for a chronic condition? Are they hospitalized or inpatient because they just had surgery? So I kind of want to know more about like what department or environment are you using this tool in? And then for what purpose are you using this tool? So this product sounds like to me that it is either administrative support or it's clinical decision support software. If you are using this tool to have a list of patients that are at risk of falling to help inform the anticipated resources that you might need for the given week, then we may be talking about administrative support for a healthcare facility. Maybe you need to have more staff on hand that are trained to help patients move from bed to bathroom. Or maybe this means that you need to have more guardrails put in or beds with guardrails, or you need to manage the number of rooms that you have open that have different handrails available to patients that are at risk of falling. But if you're using this list to look at individual patients where you are going to change care delivery, including intervention or particular activities to prevent falling, then we're getting into the clinical decision support software space. In FDA's guidance document that they released in 2022, they have a line in that document that says that any tools that are producing risk scores that are affiliated with a disease or condition would be considered medical devices. So my next question would then be, is risk of falling a disease or condition? And this is where we would present all of these findings to the SAMD review board, where I would both present the answers to whether it's being administrative support or clinical decision support software. If it's administrative support, we probably would do an abbreviated endorsement position, and then the product team would go and work with Lauren's group to ensure that they've demonstrated the AI best practices and we're not really involving ourselves with AI regulations. But if it's clinical decision support software, we have to make sure that we satisfy those 4 criteria. And we might potentially tell the product team, you're looking like you're a medical device, but here are some actions that you can take to modify the design of the tool or modify its intended use so that you're not a medical device. But ultimately, the board would help us understand if it's clinical decision support software versus administrative support. And if it's clinical decision support software, they would help me understand from a healthcare professional perspective, is risk of falling a disease or condition that we are now influencing care delivery for. Okay, I know that we're at time. I would love to keep talking about all of this with all of you. I'm sure that we could get into some really fun, nuanced regulatory conversations.
Well, thank you, Brenna. I really appreciate it. I'm going to release everyone. I wonder, Brenna, do you mind staying on, you and Lauren, for just 1 second, and Shashi?